Imagine this: a crowded luxury hotel, glittering lights, wealthy guests enjoying their night, when suddenly, the arrogant son of a millionaire lashes out and kicks a pregnant woman to the ground. Gasps fill the air, cameras start recording, and in seconds, the shocking moment goes viral across the world. But here's the twist no one saw coming: the woman's calm words, "My husband is coming," hide a truth that will shake the millionaire's empire to its core. "Step aside, you idiot, you'll ruin my suit." Brandon Whitmore's voice echoed across the grand dining hall of the Hilton Crest Hotel, one of the most exclusive venues in New York City. The chandelier lights reflected off the polished marble floors, but the beauty of the place was instantly poisoned by the cruelty of his action. In front of dozens of wealthy patrons and tourists, Brandon's foot struck a pregnant woman in the stomach. Emily Hayes crumpled to her knees, one hand shielding her unborn child, the other bracing herself against the cold, unforgiving floor. White towels she had been carrying slipped from her arms, scattering like snow over the marble. The pristine fabric contrasted sharply with the violence she had just endured. Brandon's friends, three young men in designer suits, burst out laughing. One of them held up his phone, recording every second, eager to upload the humiliation online. Their mocking voices carried across the hall, louder than the faint jazz music playing in the background. But Emily's reaction stunned them. She did not cry. She did not beg. Slowly she lifted her face. Her eyes, calm yet unyielding, locked on Brandon. Her lips moved, and her words cut through the noise like a blade. "My husband is coming." This sentence, simple yet powerful, shifted the atmosphere. Brandon felt a chill ripple through him. For the first time in his pampered, untouchable life, he sensed something he never knew: fear. Around them, the audience grew restless. Hotel guests whispered angrily from their tables. A middle-aged couple frowned, muttering about calling the police. Yet none dared step forward. Others, intoxicated by the potential for virality, lifted their phones discreetly, eager to capture the unfolding scandal. Emily moved with quiet dignity. Despite the pain radiating through her body, she rose to her feet. She bent down carefully, one by one picking up the towels that had scattered across the floor. All the while, her right hand remained firmly over her stomach, as if shielding the fragile life within from the cruelty of the world. She did not look back at Brandon. She did not speak again. She simply walked away, her footsteps steady, her presence commanding a silence far louder than screams could have. Every eye followed her. Every mind wondered, who was her husband, and what storm was about to fall upon the Whitmore dynasty? By midnight, the clip had erupted across social media. The caption blazed on every platform: "Millionaire's son attacks pregnant woman in luxury restaurant. Whitmore heir exposed." Within 3 hours, the video racked up 2 million views. Outrage exploded in the comments. Hashtags demanding justice trended nationwide. News anchors scrambled to cover the incident. Some voices demanded Brandon's arrest. Others called for boycotts of Whitmore properties. In her small apartment on the west side of the city, Emily sat quietly on the edge of her bed. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, friends checking on her, strangers sending support, journalists begging for interviews. She silenced it all. Instead, she focused on the faint kicks inside her belly. "Don't be afraid, my little one," she whispered, stroking her stomach. "I promise you, everything will be okay." But as her words lingered in the dimly lit room, Emily's heart knew the truth. The storm had only begun, and it would test not only her, but the entire Whitmore empire. The Whitmore mansion loomed on the northern edge of Manhattan, a sprawling estate hidden behind iron gates and manicured hedges. Inside, the night had been restless. Richard Whitmore, patriarch of the family, had not slept. His phone had been ringing nonstop, publicists, lawyers, and furious business partners demanding explanations. At 61, Richard was a man who prided himself on control. For 4 decades, he had built an empire brick by brick: luxury hotels, glittering malls, skyscrapers that reached into the skyline like monuments to his ambition. His net worth had crossed $200 million, and politicians called him for favors. He had weathered recessions, scandals, and fierce competitors, but nothing had shaken him like the video that went viral overnight. At 5:30 a.m., his head of public relations, Michael Sanders, called with panic in his voice, "Mr. Whitmore, the video has crossed 8 million views. It's on every platform, every channel. CNN, Fox, international outlets. Your son's name is trending globally." Richard rubbed his temples, staring at the city through the panoramic windows of his penthouse. Below, the streets were waking, but all he saw was fire protests forming, investors retreating, contracts dissolving. 8 million? He muttered, disbelief etched in his tone. "Sir," Michael pressed, "the damage is catastrophic. Protests have already begun outside Whitmore Plaza downtown. The stock market is reacting. Your company shares have dropped 30% in pre-market trading. That's billions in valuation gone." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Where is Brandon?" "In bed, apparently," Michael said bitterly. "Sleeping like nothing happened. He has no idea what storm he's unleashed." Richard slammed his fist against the marble counter. 40 years of sweat and ruthlessness, undone by one act of stupidity. Meanwhile, in a different world, Emily Hayes sat quietly at her kitchen table. The small apartment smelled faintly of lavender detergent, the kind she used to wash the baby's clothes. The curtains were thin, letting in the first rays of dawn. Her phone buzzed again, but she ignored it. She poured herself a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it. Her body still ached from the kick, but what unsettled her more was the weight of the world's attention. She had never wanted to be a spectacle. She had worked quietly, supporting herself and her unborn child while waiting for her husband's return. Yet now, strangers across the globe knew her name, her face, her pain. She placed her palm against her belly. "Stay strong," she whispered. The baby kicked faintly in response, as though answering her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she brushed them away quickly. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Emily had grown up in the quiet suburbs of Ohio. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a schoolteacher. They had taught her dignity in hardship, kindness in spite of cruelty. Those lessons were etched into her bones now. Though the world wanted outrage, she would not scream. Though millions demanded vengeance, she would not fuel hatred. She would stand in her quiet strength, because she knew her husband would soon return. Back at the mansion, Brandon finally awoke. His room was a palace unto itself, 500 square meters of luxury. Silk sheets, gold-plated fixtures, a private bar. He stretched lazily, completely oblivious to the chaos he had caused. His first words of the morning were not about the scandal. They were about the car he wanted to buy. "Dad, when are we closing the deal on the new Ferrari?" "I saw the limited edition." He stopped when he entered his father's study. Richard was pacing like a caged lion. The walls were lined with television screens, each one showing the same clip: Brandon's foot slamming into a pregnant woman's belly. Commentators debated heatedly, protesters shouted slogans, investors announced withdrawals. Richard's face was red with fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he roared. 40 years of work, destroyed in a single night. Brandon scoffed. "Dad, it's just a waitress. People will forget in a week. We'll pay her off, sweep it under the rug, like always." Richard's eyes burned with rage. "That waitress has cost us $50 million in canceled contracts overnight." $50 million. The room fell silent. Brandon blinked, finally realizing the scale of the disaster. But before he could respond, the door opened. Michael Sanders stepped in, accompanied by an older man in a perfectly tailored gray suit. His hair was silver, his eyes sharp and merciless. He carried a leather briefcase. "Richard," Michael said, his tone grave. "This is attorney Jonathan Salvatore. He represents the woman your son assaulted." Salvatore's presence filled the room with a quiet authority. He placed his briefcase on the desk and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Mr. Whitmore, I am here on behalf of my client, Emily Hayes." Richard leaned forward, desperate. "How much does she want?" "Let's not waste time." Jonathan shook his head. "This is not about money. My client is not interested in financial compensation." Brandon laughed mockingly. "So what then? Does she want me to scrub her floors?" Jonathan's gray eyes locked on him, cold and piercing. "In fact, yes. Something very much like that." He opened his briefcase and spread out documents. "Here are the conditions. Your son will work as a volunteer at St. Raphael's Community Hospital for the next 2 months. Specifically, in the maternity ward. He will clean floors, change sheets, carry food trays, assist nurses, and support expectant mothers from underprivileged backgrounds. No excuses. No absence. No privilege." Brandon's jaw dropped. "You've got to be kidding me. I'm not cleaning toilets for peasants." Jonathan remained unfazed. "The alternative," he continued, "is a lawsuit for physical assault, intentional harm, psychological damage, and discrimination. Estimated compensation, $120 million plus legal fees. Not to mention the public destruction of whatever reputation your family still clings to." Richard's chest tightened. He could feel the empire crumbling beneath his feet. "And one more thing," Jonathan added, his voice dropping. "The work will end only when my client gives birth. Until that moment, your son belongs to that hospital." The silence in the room was suffocating. Brandon's face was pale with disbelief. Richard, shaking, finally spoke. "I accept." And so it was decided. For the first time in his life, Brandon Whitmore would be forced to work. The doors of St. Raphael's Community Hospital awaited him, doors that smelled not of wealth, but of disinfectant and human struggle. As the morning sun climbed higher, the Whitmore name, once a symbol of power, now trembled under the weight of justice. And Emily Hayes, sitting quietly in her small apartment, could not yet know that her quiet strength had set in motion a transformation that would alter the Whitmore family forever. The first day Brandon Whitmore walked through the sliding glass doors of St. Raphael's Community Hospital, the staff could hardly believe it. For years they had seen his face on television tabloids, showing him stumbling drunk out of nightclubs, glossy magazines flaunting his yachts and vacations in Monaco. Now here he was, wearing a faded green volunteer uniform that smelled faintly of bleach. His expression twisted with disgust. The hospital itself was a world far removed from the polished marble floors and luxury hotels of the Whitmore Empire. The air was heavy with antiseptic. The corridors were painted dull beige, scuffed with years of wheelchairs and gurneys scraping against the walls. Nurses walked briskly, juggling clipboards and 4-poles. From the maternity ward came the cries of newborns and the low, anxious murmurs of women in labor. This was not a world of privilege. It was a world of raw life and raw struggle. At the front desk, Chief Nurse Martha Coleman awaited him. She was a woman in her 50s with lines carved deep into her face by decades of worry, fatigue, and compassion. She had worked in this hospital longer than Brandon had been alive. Her voice was brisk, her eyes unyielding. "So," she said flatly, crossing her arms. "You're the Whitmore boy." Brandon smirked. "Man, actually." Martha didn't return the smile. "In here, last names mean nothing. Money means nothing. What matters is work. Do you understand?" Brandon rolled his eyes. "Sure, whatever. Let's just get this over with." Without another word, Martha shoved a mop into his hands. "Good. Start with the floors in maternity. Room 204 had complications last night. Blood everywhere. Let's see if you can handle it." Brandon recoiled. "You want me to clean that?" Martha's gaze hardened. You're not here to want anything. You're here because your choices left a woman and her child in danger. Either you mop, or I call Mr. Salvatore and tell him you failed on day one. Then you can face court." For the first time, Brandon felt the weight of the trap around him. He gritted his teeth and dragged the mop bucket down the hall. The first hours were hell. Brandon's soft hands, used only to gripping champagne flutes and luxury car steering wheels, blistered under the rough handle of the mop. His back ached from bending, his nose stung with chemical fumes. When he tried to refuse, Martha simply raised an eyebrow and reminded him of the alternative jail time and lawsuits. By noon, his designer sneakers were ruined, splattered with disinfectant and sweat. His uniform clung to his body, damp and wrinkled. The staff looked at him with thinly veiled contempt. Some of the patients recognized him from the news and whispered among themselves. Brandon felt the sting of their judgment like daggers. Still, he tried to hold on to his arrogance. "Do you even know who I am?" He snapped at a young intern who asked him to carry a tray of samples to the lab. The intern smirked. "Yeah, I know. You're the volunteer who better get moving if he doesn't want to end up in court." Brandon's face flushed red, but he obeyed. The days stretched on like punishment. In the first week, he learned humiliation in a dozen forms. He was ordered to scrub toilets so foul they made his stomach churn. He hauled trash bags dripping with medical waste. He changed bedsheets stained with blood and sweat. He delivered meals to patients who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. At night, he collapsed into his bed, his muscles aching, his pride shredded. His once perfect hands grew red and raw, the skin splitting at the knuckles. No amount of expensive lotion could heal them. For the first time in his life, Brandon felt the grind of honest labor, and he hated it. He called his father, desperate. "Dad, this is insane. I can't do this. I'm not a janitor. I'm not some peasant." Richard's voice on the other end was colder than Brandon had ever heard. "You'll stay until that child is born. You'll stay if it kills you. Because if you walk out, we lose everything." Brandon had never heard his father sound afraid before. It silenced him. By the third week, something unexpected happened. Brandon crossed paths with Emily again. She had come to the hospital for a routine prenatal checkup. She walked slowly, wearing a simple maternity dress, her hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. Her presence was calm, dignified, so different from the chaotic swirl of nurses and patients around her. When their eyes met in the hallway, Brandon froze. He expected hatred in her gaze, venom for what he had done. But instead, she looked at him with quiet curiosity. Almost pity. It unnerved him more than anger ever could. "Mrs. Hayes, this way please," a nurse said, guiding Emily toward the examination room. As she walked, her hand instinctively cradled her stomach. Brandon felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest. For the first time, the memory of his kick replayed in his mind, not as a reckless joke, but as a near tragedy. The weight of what could have happened pressed down on him. That night, he couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, guilt gnawed at him. Over the following days, he began to notice the women around him, their stories, their resilience. Maria, just 16, abandoned by her boyfriend, but determined to raise her child. Carmen, a mother of 4, whose husband had left for Mexico and never returned. Rosa, who worked as a cleaner 12 hours a day to pay for her pregnancy checkups. These women carried burdens he had never imagined, yet they met them with courage. They smiled at their newborns with joy brighter than any yacht party. They wept quietly at losses but returned the next day with the strength to keep going. For Brandon, it was like seeing a world that had always existed just beyond his reach, invisible because he had never cared to look. One afternoon, as he struggled to pull off his gloves with cracked, bleeding hands, he found a fresh box of latex gloves neatly placed on his cart. There was no note, but he somehow knew who had left them. Emily. He stared at the box for a long time, his throat tight. His own parents had given him cars, vacations, money. But no one had ever noticed his hands before. No one had cared about his pain. And here was the woman he had hurt most, quietly offering him a kindness he didn't deserve. That night, for the first time in his life, Brandon lay awake not from anger or frustration, but from the ache of gratitude he didn't know how to express. By the end of the 4th week, whispers began to spread among the staff. Something about Brandon was changing. He no longer stormed out of tasks. He stayed late to mop the halls after emergencies. He carried food trays without complaint. He listened when Martha barked orders. He even started watching the newborns with an odd intensity, as if seeing life itself for the first time. One nurse caught him smiling faintly as a mother kissed her baby's forehead, and she almost didn't believe her eyes. Still, doubt remained. Was this real? Or just an act to escape punishment? Brandon himself didn't know yet. But for the first time he wondered. Who was he, if not the arrogant heir everyone despised? Who could he become if he truly tried? The question lingered like a seed, small but alive. And Emily Hayes, unknowingly, had planted it. While Brandon struggled at the hospital, the world outside only grew harsher for the Whitmores. Protests escalated in front of Whitmore-owned hotels. Stock values continued to plummet. Politicians began distancing themselves. Editorials blasted the family as a symbol of America's widening divide between rich and poor. Richard, once untouchable, now faced sleepless nights and endless calls from furious partners. Valerie, Brandon's younger sister, watched her social life crumble as friends abandoned her to escape the stain of scandal that the Whitmore name was rotting. And the only possible redemption lay in the hands of the family's most disgraced son at St. Raphael's. Brandon scrubbed at another floor, sweat dripping down his back, his raw hands trembling on the mop handle. For the first time, he realized this wasn't punishment anymore. It was the beginning of something he had never known: transformation. By the start of the 5th week, Brandon Whitmore had become a strange sight in the halls of St. Raphael's Community Hospital. Once the most arrogant heir in Manhattan, he now spent his days hauling laundry carts, disinfecting beds, and running lab samples down to the basement. His designer shoes had long been ruined. Now he wore cheap white sneakers issued by the hospital. His hair, once carefully styled, was messy from sweat. His manicured hands were scarred and blistered. But more than his appearance, it was his eyes that had changed. They no longer held the empty gleam of a spoiled youth. Now there was something heavier, quieter, watching everything around him with a strange mix of shame and awakening. Emily Returns It was during this week that Brandon saw Emily Hayes again, not as the fragile victim of a viral video, but as a mother-to-be in the final stages of pregnancy. She arrived for a prenatal checkup, moving slowly, her hands steady over her round belly. She wore a plain navy blue maternity dress, her hair tied back simply. There was no makeup, no jewelry, yet she radiated a kind of grace that silenced even the busiest corridor. Brandon was cleaning the waiting area when she passed. His breath caught in his throat. The memory of that night, the cruel laughter, his reckless kick came rushing back like a tidal wave. Shame burned through him, hotter than any punishment. Emily's gaze fell on him for a brief moment. Not with hatred, not with fury, but with something unexpected: observation. She looked at him as one might study a storm cloud to see whether it would bring rain or thunder. Then she walked on, her quiet dignity untouched. That look haunted Brandon for days. It was not condemnation, but it demanded an answer. Who are you now? Stories of the mothers working in the maternity ward. Brandon began hearing the stories of the women around him. Their voices, once background noise, now pierced through his indifference. There was Maria, only 16, abandoned by her boyfriend the moment he discovered her pregnancy. She came alone, her hands trembling as she signed admission forms. There was Carmen, with 4 children already. Her husband gone to Mexico years ago, sending no money, leaving her to raise the family alone. There was Rosa, a single mother working as a hotel maid 12 hours a day, just to afford prenatal vitamins and basic check dash-ups. Each woman carried burdens heavier than Brandon had ever known, yet they faced them with courage. They smiled at the sound of their babies' heartbeats. They endured pain with a quiet ferocity he had never imagined. They reminded him of something he had never valued: strength without privilege. For the first time, Brandon began to understand that wealth could not measure worth. A gesture of kindness one evening. After hours of scrubbing bathrooms, Brandon sat exhausted at the supply cart. His hands were raw, red, and cracked from cleaning chemicals. He flexed his fingers and winced. That's when he noticed something new on his cart: a fresh box of latex gloves, better quality than the flimsy ones usually supplied. No note, no explanation. Just the gloves neatly placed. He looked around confused, until his eyes landed on Emily at the far end of the hall, speaking softly with a nurse. She didn't glance his way, but something inside him knew. It had been her. His throat tightened. His parents had given him sports cars, vacations, wads of cash, but never once had anyone cared about his hands. Yet here was the woman he had hurt most, quietly noticing his pain, offering him comfort without a word. That night, Brandon lay awake in his small volunteer's dorm, staring at the ceiling. He had no language for the ache in his chest. Gratitude, guilt, hope. It all tangled together until he finally understood. Kindness had power greater than any wealth he had ever flaunted. A crisis in the ward late one night. An 18-year-old girl named Andrea was rushed into the hospital. She was in premature labor, terrified, sobbing that she had no money to pay. Her boyfriend had abandoned her. Her family had cast her out. She was utterly alone. Dr. Ramirez, notorious for his short temper, muttered angrily, "If you can't pay, go to the state hospital. We don't do charity here." Brandon, overhearing from the hallway, felt his heart lurch. Something inside him snapped. He stepped forward before he even realized he was speaking. "I'll pay for her," he said firmly. The doctor turned, incredulous. You're just a volunteer." Brandon straightened his shoulders. "Then put it on my record. Whatever it takes, I'll cover it." "She stays." For the first time, he used his Whitmore name not as a weapon, but as a shield. Andrea looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I don't even know you." "You don't need to," Brandon replied softly. "Just focus on bringing your baby safely into the world." That night, Brandon stayed by her side. He held her hand during contractions, whispered encouragements when her fear overwhelmed her, fetched water when she was thirsty. He watched as the doctors worked and as Andrea finally delivered a healthy baby boy. When she cradled her newborn, she whispered, "His name will be Andrew." After the angel who stood by me tonight, Brandon left the room with wet eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than adrenaline or indulgence. He felt purpose, the seed of change the staff noticed. Nurse Martha, who had once despised him, approached with a faint smile. "You did good tonight, kid. That child has a chance because of you." Brandon shook his head. "I just did what anyone would." Martha's smile faded. "No, not anyone. I've worked here 30 years. I've seen plenty of rich men walk past suffering without lifting a finger. Tonight, you didn't." Her words sank into him like roots. Emily speaks days later. Emily came for another checkup. She was heavy with pregnancy now, moving slowly, her face glowing with the quiet radiance of a woman about to give life. As she passed Brandon's desk, she paused. "I heard what you did for Andrea," she said softly. Brandon looked up, expecting sarcasm or reproach. Instead, he saw something else in her eyes, cautious approval. "She needed help," he muttered. "Yes," Emily replied, her hand circling her belly. "And you gave it, without asking for anything in return. That matters." Brandon swallowed hard. Emily, what I did to you, I can never undo it. Her gaze hardened for a moment. That kick could have killed my child. It could have killed me. The silence that followed was heavier than steel. But, she continued after a long pause, I've watched you these weeks. I've seen you mop floors without complaint. I've seen you sit with patients when they cry. I've seen you look at newborns as if you're seeing life for the first time. I don't know if you've changed, Brandon, but I see that you're trying. And that's more important than my forgiveness. Then she walked away, leaving him trembling with emotions he could barely name. A glimmer of redemption. That night, Brandon stood in the nursery, staring at the rows of tiny newborns swaddled in blankets. Their chests rose and fell in fragile rhythm. Each one was a life, a future, a universe waiting to unfold. He pressed his hand against the glass, his eyes wet. For 22 years, he had lived as if nothing mattered but his own pleasure. But here, in the quiet hum of machines and the soft cries of infants, he finally understood. Life was sacred. And for the first time, Brandon Whitmore wanted to protect it. Outside, the storm against the Whitmore empire still raged: lawsuits, protests, collapsing deals. But inside the walls of St. Raphael's, something more powerful was happening. The fall of a dynasty had given birth to the possibility of redemption. And it all hinged on whether Brandon could finish what he had begun, not as punishment, but as transformation. The sixth week of Brandon's service at St. Raphael's Hospital began not with mop buckets or laundry carts, but with an emergency that shook the entire ward to its core. It was 2 a.m. on a rainy Thursday when the hospital alarm rang through the maternity floor. Nurses rushed, stretchers squeaked against the tiles, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Brandon, finishing a late cleaning shift, froze as he saw two figures burst through the doors. It was Emily, her face pale, lips pressed tight and pain-cradled in the arms of a tall, broad-shouldered man whose presence filled the hallway. His dark hair was flecked with gray, his sharp jaw tense, his uniform unmistakable. He was a soldier. His voice thundered with desperation as he shouted, "Doctor, my wife is bleeding. Help her." Brandon's stomach dropped. This was the moment Emily had spoken of weeks ago, the husband who was coming, the arrival of Matthew. Hayes, the man's name was Matthew Hayes, a decorated Army veteran, brother to Richard Whitmore, the elder sibling who had severed ties with the family 15 years ago. While the Whitmores built their empire of glass towers, Matthew had chosen service, disappearing into classified missions overseas. Rumors whispered he had died years ago. Yet here he was, alive, carrying his wife, his uniform soaked in rain and worry. Doctors and nurses swarmed. Brandon pressed himself against the wall, his chest tightening as he watched Emily carried past him. Her eyes, half closed from pain, flicked toward him for a fleeting second. There was no hatred there, no fear. Only a silent, unspoken message. "Now you will understand." Matthew followed the gurney into the operating wing until he was stopped by hospital staff. He turned, and for the first time, his gaze locked on Brandon. Those eyes, steel gray, full of fire and discipline, burned into him. Brandon felt himself shrink. "You," Matthew said coldly. "Are you the one who—" Before the accusation could finish, a nurse interrupted. "Sir, please wait outside. We need space to work." Matthew's fists clenched, but he obeyed, pacing the corridor like a caged lion. The weight of helplessness for the next 2 hours. Brandon sat across from his estranged uncle in the waiting area. Neither spoke at first. Matthew's hands gripped his knees, trembling not from weakness, but from the unbearable fear of losing the woman he loved. Brandon, for once, had no arrogance left. Finally he whispered, "Can I stay here? With you?" Matthew shot him a glare sharp enough to wound. But then slowly he exhaled. "You don't owe me. You owe her. You stay because you must, not because I need you." So they sat. Two men bound by blood, yet separated by 15 years of silence. listening to the muffled sounds of life and death on the other side of the doors. It was in that silence that Matthew spoke again, his voice low. "When you were little, you used to follow me everywhere. You said you wanted to be a soldier like me. Do you remember?" Brandon swallowed hard. I remember." Matthew's eyes softened, if only slightly. "Do you know why I left the family? Why I never came back?" Brandon shook his head. "Because I saw what money did to all of you," Matthew said. "I saw how your father treated workers like disposable tools. I saw your mother look down on anyone who wasn't wealthy. I saw you and Valerie grow up thinking the world owed you everything just because of your last name. I couldn't stay. I chose a life where worth is measured by sacrifice, not by wealth." His voice cracked. "And now, the woman I love, the one pure thing I found outside that poisoned legacy, is in danger. Because of you." Brandon's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself. But he couldn't. His mind replayed that night in the restaurant, the kick, the laughter, the towels scattering. Shame crushed him like a weight he could no longer carry. The turning point at dawn, the operating doors opened. The doctor stepped out, exhaustion etched on his face. "Mr. Hayes, your wife is stable. We managed the complications. And you have a healthy baby boy." Matthew collapsed onto a chair, his body trembling as years of soldierly composure cracked. He buried his face in his hands, whispering prayers of gratitude. Brandon felt tears sting his own eyes. Relief, pure and undeserved, washed over him. When they were finally allowed into the recovery room, Emily lay pale but smiling, a tiny bundle swaddled in blue nestled in her arms. Matthew approached first, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made Brandon ache with envy. "He's perfect," Emily whispered. "What should we name him?" Matthew asked, his voice trembling. Emily looked at the baby, then at Matthew. "Gabriel," she said softly. "After the archangel who protects families." Matthew nodded, tears slipping down his hardened face. Brandon lingered at the door, afraid to intrude. But then Emily's voice called gently, "Brandon." "Come closer." He froze. Slowly, he stepped forward, each foot heavy as stone. The sight before him, Emily glowing with maternal love, Matthew standing protectively beside her, and the newborn cradled in peace felt like holy ground. "Would you like to hold him?" Emily asked. Brandon's hands shook. I don't deserve to. I want you to," she insisted. "So you feel the weight of the life you once endangered and the life you now must protect." With trembling arms, Brandon took the baby. Gabriel's tiny fingers curled around his thumb. His breath caught, his chest burning. In that moment, everything inside him shattered, the arrogance, the pride, the cruelty. He began to sob, not the performative cries of a spoiled heir, but the raw, cleansing tears of a man realizing the depth of his sins. "I'm sorry," he whispered hoarsely. "Emily, Matthew, Gabriel, I'm so sorry." Matthew stepped closer, his hand heavy on Brandon's shoulder. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice both stern and forgiving, he said, "This is the moment you decide who you will be. A Whitmore who destroys or a man who redeems." Brandon nodded, cradling Gabriel closer, his tears falling onto the baby's blanket. For the first time, he wanted to live not for himself, but for something greater. The family reckoning news of Gabriel's birth spread quickly through the family. Richard Whitmore, exhausted from weeks of collapsing business deals and public shame, came to the hospital himself. For the first time in years, he saw his elder brother Matthew standing before him. The reunion was tense. Decades of bitterness lay between them. But when Richard saw Emily, pale but smiling, and when he held tiny Gabriel in his arms, something inside him broke too. He whispered, "I thought I lost my brother forever. Maybe I still have a chance." Matthew's reply was firm but not cruel. "You have a chance only if you change." For him. For them, Richard nodded. silently accepting the truth he had long denied. A new bond over the next days. Brandon returned to the hospital, not just as a volunteer, but as family. He sat with Emily, fetching her water, adjusting her pillows, learning how fragile and strong motherhood could be at once. He walked the halls beside Matthew, asking questions about the life he had lived in service, hearing stories of sacrifice and honor that humbled him to the bone. And when he looked at Gabriel, he felt something he had never known before, love not for what someone could give him, but simply for who they were. The arrogant boy who had once kicked a pregnant woman was gone. In his place stood a man, unsteady but growing, reaching for redemption one day at a time. Outside, the protests against the Whitmore Empire still roared. But inside St. Raphael's, a different revolution was happening. Not of wealth or politics, but of hearts of a family rediscovering what it meant to be human. And it all began with a baby's tiny hand curling around a fallen man's finger. The following weeks unfolded like a long, unbroken lesson for Brandon Whitmore. Gabriel's birth had not just been a family event, it had been a spiritual earthquake. Every moment inside St. Raphael's Hospital from that day forward seemed magnified, heavy with meaning, as if the universe itself was determined to press this new truth into his bones. Life. After Gabriel's birth, Emily remained in the hospital for several days as she recovered. Brandon visited her room daily, though never alone at first, always with Matthew nearby, whose watchful eyes still carried doubt. But even Matthew could not ignore how different Brandon seemed now. He would arrive early in the mornings, quietly adjusting the pillows behind Emily's back, fetching warm tea from the cafeteria, and sitting beside her while she nursed Gabriel. He never spoke much during those moments. He simply watched the miracle of a child feeding, the serenity in Emily's face, the gentle protectiveness in Matthew's stance. Brandon, who had once lived in the roar of nightclubs and sports car engines, now found himself humbled by the soft rhythm of a newborn's breathing. One afternoon, as Emily dozed with Gabriel sleeping on her chest, Matthew broke the silence. "Why are you here, really?" His voice was low, cautious. Brandon's eyes remained fixed on the baby. "Because I need to be. Because I can't undo what I did, but I can learn never to repeat it." Matthew studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Words are easy. Time will show if you mean them." The hospital routine back in the maternity ward. Brandon resumed his duties with a different heart. Where once he had seen chores as humiliation, he now approached them with patience. He scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, carried food trays without complaint, and stayed late to help nurses after emergencies. The staff, once skeptical, began to soften. Nurse Martha, who had shown him nothing but steel in the beginning, now gave him nods of approval. One evening, after he stayed 3 hours past his shift to clean up after a difficult delivery, she clapped him on the back. "You've come a long way, kid. Don't stop now." Even the patients noticed. Some whispered, "Isn't that the Whitmore boy from the news?" But their tones shifted from judgment to curiosity. They saw him carrying blankets, holding crying infants so mothers could rest, listening to their worries as if they mattered more than anything else in the world. The lesson of sacrifice. One night, an emergency flooded the ward. A citywide blackout had knocked out parts of the hospital's backup power system. Machines beeped erratically, nurses shouted orders, and fear swept through the halls. Brandon, instead of hiding, ran straight into the chaos. He held flashlights while doctors worked. He sprinted down staircases to fetch supplies from powerless storage rooms. He even helped push a generator cart with 3 other men. His arms shaking, sweat pouring down his face. In the nursery, when the incubators faltered, he sat for hours manually pumping air through tiny hand ventilators, refusing to rest until the power stabilized. By the time the lights flickered back to life, his arms were numb, but every infant in that room was still breathing. When Martha found him afterward, collapsed in a chair with tears streaking his dirt-streaked face, she simply said, "Tonight you saved lives, Brandon." That's more than most people ever do in a lifetime. Family confrontations, meanwhile. The Whitmore empire continued to crumble. The stock market punished the family name daily. Protesters gathered at hotels carrying signs that read "Justice for Emily" and "The rich are not above the law." Investors fled. Contracts dissolved. Reputations rotted. Richard Whitmore, who once commanded boardrooms with a flick of his hand, now sat in meetings where his voice carried no weight. His hair turned grayer by the week. His health faltered under the pressure. For the first time, he began to admit, though only to himself, that perhaps Matthew had been right to leave the family's toxic arrogance behind. Valerie, Brandon's younger sister, faced her own reckoning. Her glamorous parties emptied. Friends stopped answering her calls. Her name, once glittering in socialite columns, now appeared only in angry hashtags. She visited the hospital one afternoon, her eyes red from crying, her expensive clothes unable to mask her despair. "Brandon," she whispered, "how do you bear it? Everyone hates us." For the first time in his life, Brandon didn't tell her to run or hide. He sat her down in the hospital cafeteria and said, "You don't bear it alone. You start by serving someone other than yourself." He showed her how to fold baby blankets, how to deliver meal trays. Valerie laughed at first, embarrassed, but by the end of the day, she was smiling. It was small, but it was a start. Matthew's watchful eye, though Matthew saw signs of change in his nephew. He refused to give trust cheaply. He shadowed Brandon often, testing his endurance. He would send him on grueling tasks, lifting heavy supply crates, sitting through overnight shifts, handling the dirtiest chores. He wanted to see if Brandon would break, but Brandon did not. Each challenge only carved away more of his arrogance. One dawn, after working through the night, Brandon found Matthew waiting for him outside the ward. "You didn't quit," Matthew said. "I can't," Brandon replied simply. "Not when I see what's at stake." For the first time, Matthew's stern face cracked into the faintest hint of a smile. Emily's final trial 2 weeks later. Emily's time came. At 2 a.m., labor pains struck fiercely. The ward erupted into motion. Brandon was there when Matthew carried her down the corridor, her face pale with strain. He ran alongside, fetching blankets, alerting nurses, holding doors open. The labor was long and brutal. Hours passed. Sweat beaded on Emily's brow, her cries echoing through the ward. Brandon stood outside the delivery room, pacing, whispering silent prayers he didn't even know he believed in. Finally, the cry of a newborn pierced the air. The door opened, and a nurse emerged, smiling. A baby boy. Both mother and child are safe. Relief washed over Matthew like a tidal wave. He stumbled into the room, kissing Emily's hand, tears streaking his hardened soldier's face. Brandon followed cautiously, afraid to intrude, until Emily herself beckoned him closer. "Come," she said softly. "Meet Gabriel." The baby lay swaddled, tiny and perfect. Brandon stared, his heart swelling with emotions he couldn't contain. When Emily placed the child in his arms, his tears fell freely. The weight of the newborn was unlike anything he had ever carried, fragile, pure, yet infinitely heavy with meaning. "I nearly destroyed this life before it began," Brandon whispered, his voice shaking. "But now, I will protect it, always." Matthew stood beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Then you've taken your first step as a man." Redemption's dawn. The days that followed marked a quiet rebirth for the Whitmore family. Richard began stepping back from business, channeling his wealth into a foundation that supported single mothers and underfunded hospitals. Valerie, inspired by her brother's transformation, started working at a shelter for vulnerable women, and Brandon, once the most despised heir in America, remained at St. Raphael's even after his punishment officially ended. He applied for training as a nurse's aide, determined to dedicate his life to the place that had broken him down and rebuilt him. The world outside still remembered his cruelty, still debated whether he deserved redemption. But inside the hospital, among the mothers and infants he now served, Brandon no longer needed to prove himself to strangers. His proof lay in every life he touched, every tear he wiped away, every newborn he cradled in arms that once knew only destruction. The new legacy one evening. Months later, as the sun dipped over Manhattan, Brandon stood outside the hospital with Matthew and Emily. Gabriel slept peacefully in Emily's arms, his tiny breaths a lullaby. Brandon looked at his uncle. "I don't want to be a Whitmore anymore, not the way it used to mean. I want to build something new. A family name that stands for compassion, not cruelty." Matthew nodded slowly. "Then you will. Not by speeches, not by wealth, but by what you do every single day." Brandon smiled faintly, his eyes wet as he reached out to gently touch Gabriel's cheek. "Then let today be the first of many." And as night fell, the city lights flickering to life around them, it was no longer the empire of marble towers or luxury hotels that defined the Whitmores. It was this small circle of family hearts remade, bonds restored, and a baby named Gabriel whose life symbolized the dawn of redemption. For Brandon, the boy who once thought himself untouchable, the lesson was finally clear. True power was never in wealth. It was in service. True wealth was never in possessions. It was in love. And true redemption was never granted, it was lived, one act of humility at a time. 5 years passed. The name Whitmore no longer carried the same glitter it once had. The empire Richard Whitmore had built still existed, but it no longer commanded awe. Instead, it carried the weight of a scandal that had forever scarred its reputation. Yet for those who lived inside the family, those 5 years were not defined by ruin, they were defined by rebirth. The Garden of Change, the Whitmore estate, once a fortress of wealth and arrogance, had been transformed. Gone were the marble statues that lined the gardens, cold and expressionless monuments to vanity. In their place stood apple and cherry trees, their branches heavy with fruit. The perfectly manicured lawns that had once been forbidden for anyone to step on were now a playground. Wooden swings swayed in the breeze. A sandbox brimmed with toys. Laughter filled the air where silence and judgment had once reigned. Brandon, now 27, pushed 5-year-old Gabriel on the swing. The boy's bright laughter echoed across the yard. He had his father's steel gray eyes, but his mother's warmth. His small hands gripped the chains, his legs pumping in rhythm, as he shouted, "Higher, Uncle Leo! Higher!" Brandon laughed a laugh free of mockery or arrogance, just joy. "If I push you any higher, you'll touch the clouds, kid." Nearby, Valerie watched from the porch. No longer the spoiled socialite she once was, she now ran a shelter for pregnant women who had nowhere else to go. Inspired by Emily and by her brother's transformation, she dedicated her life to giving dignity to those who had been abandoned by society. Seeing Brandon with Gabriel always made her smile because it was proof that people could change. A quiet household inside the house, Emily rocked gently on the sofa, her hand resting on her belly. She was pregnant again, this time with a girl. Matthew stood behind her, his hands folded over hers. "Esperanza," Emily whispered. "That's what we'll call her, Hope." Matthew kissed her hair. "Fitting. Because that's what you brought to this family." Richard Whitmore, gray-haired and retired, shuffled into the living room with a fishing rod slung over his shoulder. Once the iron-fisted tycoon who bent markets to his will, he now spent his days teaching Gabriel to fish in a small pond they had dug behind the house. His voice had softened, his pride tempered. He had stepped down from business entirely, handing the remains of his empire to professional managers, and instead devoting his fortune to the Whitmore Foundation, an organization that provided jobs and health care for single mothers. At the start, many had called it a publicity stunt. But Richard didn't care. He wasn't chasing reputation anymore. He was chasing redemption in his own way. Brandon's new life. Brandon no longer lived in the mansion. He had chosen a modest apartment near St. Raphael's Hospital, where he now worked full-time as a coordinator for the volunteer program. He had completed his training as a nurse's aide and specialized in neonatal care. Every day, he guided new volunteers, many of them young, privileged men and women whose parents thought charity work might look good on college applications. He saw himself in their smug faces. He recognized their arrogance, their entitlement. And patiently, firmly, he broke it down. "Here," he would say, handing them a mop. "Start with the floors." That's where I started. At first, they sneered. But under his watchful eye, under the weight of the ward's reality, mothers crying in pain, infants clinging to life, many softened, just as he once had. Brandon became a mentor without meaning to. His story had spread quietly in the hospital, the millionaire's son who once disgraced himself, but found redemption among the weakest. Patients whispered it. Staff admired it. Even the new generation of doctors respected it. Dinner with family one warm summer evening. Brandon returned to the estate for dinner. Gabriel greeted him at the gate, running with arms wide open. "Uncle Leo. Uncle Leo." Brandon scooped him up, spinning him around. The boys' laughter filled the air, echoing through the garden at the dinner table. The family gathered, Matthew at the head, Emily radiant in her pregnancy, Richard quieter but smiling, Valerie chatting animatedly about her shelter. Gabriel sat beside Brandon, refusing to eat until his uncle told him a story. "Tell me again about the hospital, Uncle Leo," Gabriel begged. "The one where you saved the babies during the blackout." Brandon chuckled. "Haven't I told you that story 100 times already? But I like it. Especially the part where you pumped air for the tiny babies all night," Gabriel said, his eyes shining. Emily smiled softly. "He wants to hear it because he knows it's true. Because he knows his uncle became a man that night." Brandon's throat tightened. He looked around the table. The family he had almost destroyed, the family that had become his salvation. For the first time in years, he felt not shame, but gratitude. Gabriel's question after dinner. Brandon sat with Gabriel in the garden, the fireflies glowing faintly in the dusk. The boy's voice was curious, innocent. "Uncle Leo, is it true you were bad before I was born?" Brandon froze. He hadn't expected the question. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes, Gabriel. I was very bad. I hurt people. I hurt your mother. I hurt you before you even came into the world." Gabriel tilted his head, thinking with the seriousness only a child could carry. "But you're not bad now, right?" Brandon's eyes filled with tears. He crouched down so they were eye to eye. "I try not to be. Every day, I try to be better. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's hard. But I never stop trying. And do you know why?" Gabriel leaned closer. "Why?" "Because of you," Brandon whispered. "Because you remind me what life is worth." The boy smiled, simple and pure. "Then you're good now. Mommy says people can change if they want to. And I think you did." Brandon pulled him into an embrace, hiding his tears in the boy's hair. "I love you, Gabriel. More than anything." The legacy of redemption. Later that night, as the adults shared coffee on the porch, Brandon looked up at the stars. Once, he would have ignored them, too obsessed with himself, too busy chasing hollow pleasures. Now they filled him with awe. "Do you know what's strange?" he said to Matthew. "I'm happier now, working in a hospital and living on a small salary, than I ever was when I had unlimited credit cards and cars." Matthew smiled knowingly. "That's because you finally learned the difference between price and value." "What's the difference?" Brandon asked. Matthew pointed toward Gabriel, now dozing in Emily's arms. "Price is what you pay. Value is what you get in return. That boy has no price, but his value is infinite." Brandon nodded, his chest swelling with understanding. "Like forgiveness. Like love. Like second chances. A chance encounter later, as Brandon drove back to his apartment, he stopped at a red light. On the sidewalk, he saw a young pregnant woman struggling to walk, her face pale, her steps unsteady. Without hesitation, he pulled over. "Excuse me, miss. Do you need help?" The woman hesitated, distrust flashing in her eyes. But something in Brandon's face, gentler now, humbled, reassured her. "I'm looking for St. Raphael's," she said weakly. "They told me they take emergencies, even if you can't pay." Brandon smiled softly. "That's true. I work there. Let me take you." He helped her into his car, drove her to the hospital, and stayed until she was admitted. As he walked back to his car, he noticed a note tucked under the windshield wiper. In neat handwriting, it read, "Thank you for proving angels still walk the earth. Maria Fernandez." Brandon tucked the note into his wallet, next to a photo of himself holding newborn Gabriel 5 years earlier. It was his reminder that redemption was not a destination, but a choice renewed every single day. The true inheritance. That night, before bed, Brandon opened the journal he had begun during his transformation. He wrote, "Dear future me, today Gabriel asked if I used to be bad. I told him the truth. But I also realized something. I wasn't truly bad, I was lost. I confused privilege with worth, power with strength, and price with value. Now I know the truth. True strength is protecting the vulnerable. True wealth is the love you give and receive. True greatness is serving others. Tomorrow is another chance to live that truth. To honor the second chance I've been given. To prove that change is possible. Gabriel is right, I have changed. Because I have learned to love." He closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay in bed with a quiet smile. The Whitmore name, once a symbol of arrogance, now carried a new legacy, one not written in marble towers or bank accounts, but in the lives touched, the children saved, the love shared. And as sleep carried him into dreams, Brandon knew redemption was not just possible. It was real. It was alive. And it was his. The years rolled forward like a tide that could not be stopped. What had once begun as punishment for Brandon Whitmore had transformed into an entirely new life. The boy who once embodied arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty was now a man known not for wealth, but for service. And though the scars of his past still clung to him like shadows, they no longer defined him. They reminded him. They guided him. A new dawn for the Millionaire'S. Whitmore Mansion was no longer the fortress of pride it had once been. Its marble halls no longer echoed with the footsteps of servants treated like ghosts. Instead, they rang with laughter, children's laughter, the truest sound of change. Gabriel, now 10 years old, dashed through the gardens, his friends chasing him. Esperanza, Emily and Matthew's daughter, toddled behind, her curls bouncing as she clung to Valerie's hand. Brandon often watched them from the porch, his heart full. The playground in the yard had expanded. It was no longer only for family, it had become open to neighborhood children. Every weekend, families from the nearby blocks gathered, filling the estate with life. Where once the Whitmores had walled themselves off, now the gates were wide open. Richard, now older, frailer, sat in a rocking chair beneath the apple trees he had planted years before. His eyes often filled with tears as he watched the children play. The tycoon who had once crushed competitors with ruthless precision now measured his success in smiles. His greatest pride was not the towers he had built, but the foundation that bore his name, one that funded scholarships, hospitals, and shelters. "My empire," he often said, "was never real until it served others." Brandon's work at the Hospitalist. Raphael's hospital had become Brandon's second home. His days were long 12-hour shifts, sometimes more, but he thrived. He had risen to the role of head of the volunteer program, coordinating hundreds of young men and women each year. At first, many came unwilling, sent by parents who wanted to polish resumes or judges who handed out community service. Brandon recognized the smirks, the entitlement, the same arrogance he had once carried like a crown. He broke through it the only way he knew, by putting them to work where life and death were most fragile. "You think you're above this?" he would tell them, handing over a mop or a bedpan. "So did I, until I learned the floor you clean today may save a baby's life tomorrow." They rolled their eyes. But after days of seeing women in pain, infants fighting for breath, mothers clutching their newborns with tears of joy or despair, their arrogance cracked. Some quit, many stayed. And those who stayed left different than they arrived, just as he had. Brandon also trained as a neonatal nurse. His hands, once only soft from champagne flutes and steering wheels, had grown steady, precise, compassionate. He learned to swaddle infants, to check heartbeats, to comfort mothers in their most vulnerable hours. He was no doctor, but he had become indispensable in the ward. He often sat at night in the nursery, the soft hum of machines around him, tiny lives sleeping in glass cribs. In their fragile chests rising and falling, he saw the miracle of every breath. And he whispered prayers, not the kind his family once mocked, but prayers of gratitude for second chances. Emily's place in his life, Emily, remained a quiet force in Brandon's world. Though he had once nearly destroyed her life, she had also been the one to plant the seed of his redemption. Her steady gaze, her refusal to respond with hatred, had become the compass by which he measured himself. They were not friends in the simple sense, too much history, too much pain. But they were bound by something deeper, truth. Emily never let him forget the past, yet she never withheld hope for his future. One afternoon years later, as they sat together outside the hospital while Esperanza played nearby, Emily turned to him. "You know, Brandon," she said softly, "for a long time I thought you were beyond saving. But then I realized, if you were beyond saving, you wouldn't hurt the way you did. And hurt, when faced honestly, is the beginning of change." Brandon swallowed, his throat tight. "I'll never stop trying to make it right." "You don't have to erase the past," Emily replied. "You just have to live differently now." "And you are." Matthew Hayes never fully dropped his soldier's caution. He watched his nephew with eyes that had seen war, betrayal, and human weakness. But as years passed, even he had to admit Brandon had proven himself. One evening, after a long hospital shift, Brandon returned to the mansion to find Matthew waiting in the study. The fireplace glowed, casting shadows on the walls. "You've done well," Matthew said simply. Brandon shook his head. "I'm just doing what I should have done all along." Matthew stepped closer. "No, you're doing more. You turned a curse into a gift. You took the worst mistake of your life and let it forge you into something better. That takes courage." Brandon blinked, stunned. To receive praise from Matthew, the uncle he had once disgraced, the man who had hated everything the Whitmore stood for, felt heavier than any award. "Thank you," Brandon whispered. Matthew clasped his shoulder. "Just don't stop. Redemption isn't a finish line. It's a road. And you've only just begun." Valerie's shelter grew into one of the most respected organizations in the city. At first, she struggled, mocked by those who thought she was playing charity. But she persevered. She sat with frightened young women, comforted them, provided resources. She raised funds tirelessly, even selling pieces of her jewelry and art to keep the shelter alive. One day, Brandon visited and found her reading stories to a group of pregnant teenagers. Their faces were tired, yet they smiled. Valerie looked up, her eyes brighter than he had ever seen. "I finally understand," she told him later. "All those years, I thought our worth was in the parties, the fame. But it's here. It's in giving dignity to people who've been denied it." Brandon hugged her, proud in a way he had never been proud of his sister before. Richard's final years, as Richard's health declined, he spent most of his days with Gabriel and Esperanza. He taught them how to fish, how to plant trees, how to tell stories from the past, both victories and regrets. He never hid his mistakes from them. Your grandfather once thought money was everything, he told Gabriel one afternoon by the pond. But it was love that saved us. Never forget that, boy. Love saves more than money ever can. When Richard passed quietly in his sleep at 70, the family buried him beneath the apple trees he had planted. The funeral was small, no grand displays, no political guests, no pomp. Just family, friends, and the many mothers and children whose lives had been touched by the Whitmore Foundation. On his gravestone were carved words Richard himself had chosen. What we give defines us more than what we take. Brandon wept openly that day, not just for a father lost, but for a man who had finally learned what it meant to live. The true legacy years later. Gabriel, now a teenager, asked his uncle again about the past. "Uncle Leo, is it true you once hurt Mom?" Brandon sat with him beneath the apple trees, his voice steady. "Yes, and it's the greatest shame of my life. But it was also the moment that taught me who I never want to be again. It's why I work at the hospital. It's why I serve others. Because people can change, Gabriel." "I did," Gabriel nodded, his eyes wise beyond his years. "Then that's what I'll remember. Not what you were, but who you became." Brandon pulled him close, tears shining. In that moment, he knew the true inheritance he was leaving was not wealth, but proof. Proof that even the most broken person could rise again. Epilogue. A world beyond. As time went on, the Whitmore estate became less of a mansion and more of a community hub. Families came for picnics, children played freely, volunteers gathered before shifts at the hospital. The gates that had once been locked in arrogance remained forever open. Brandon, now older, still walked the halls of St. Raphael's, still cradled newborns, still guided lost youth toward compassion. His journal had grown thick with years of entries, confessions, lessons, promises to himself. And on the final page he wrote, "I once thought redemption was something to earn, something given by others. But I was wrong. Redemption is lived, day by day, act by act. It is not in what the world forgives me for, but in what I choose to become. I was lost. I was cruel. But now I am found. And I am free." The story of the Whitmores did not end with towers or scandals. It ended with children's laughter under apple trees, with women finding safety in Valerie's shelter, with newborns saved in Brandon's arms, with Matthew's unwavering guidance, and with Emily's quiet, unyielding grace. And above it all, Gabriel and Esperanza grew, carrying the legacy not of arrogance, but of love. Because in the end, the greatest empire ever built was not of stone or money, it was of hearts healed, lives redeemed, and a family reborn.